and you go, right?
Right.
Yep.
All right. And we're off? Question mark? I'm Ron Burgundy.
Yay. Awesome.
Welcome back, intrepid followers. If I can get my stream to load so I can see the chat. So I can just make sure everything is going great. We're being slow, but I think we are working. So, welcome back to Kudomusicology, a Ludomusicology literature review. Being slow and mute the stream because I don't need to hear myself twice. Ah, the chat does not look like trash. I think I like this little 8-bit theme. What do you think, Ryan?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good,
All
actually.
right.
Depending on traffic, if we get a lot of viewers eventually,
I
we
can
might have to
change the
lower the
size.
size. Yeah.
I
But
thought
otherwise, I think it
having
looks really nice. Bigger text is always better when you can have
that
it, though.
that's what I thought, having like nice big bold text. So,
Yes.
anyway, welcome. Today I'm very excited to have with me Dr. Ryan Thompson, who is our stream guru. Started the Ludomusicology
Ah,
streams 5 years ago, just over 5 years ago, by asking me and Doug Perry and Mike.
and Michael. Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
Michael Harris to
Michael
join
Harris
us.
to join us, and it was pitched as sort of like a Criterion Collection commentary almost.
Yeah.
Um,
On this game specifically,
on this
I will
game
note.
specifically, with the idea that we would talk about the music in real time while we played, and then as folks got busy, we sort of swapped in to our sort of regular hosts, who are now Ryan, me, Karen Cook, and Jillian Grasso. And then, of course, as you've seen, if you watch our Thursday night streams, we stream most Thursdays from 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern. Um, we've had all wonderful number of guests, especially lately, because almost
Yes.
as if it was like a 5-year anniversary present to us. Square released the remasters, and Final Fantasy VI came out like right after our actual 5-year anniversary. So how kind of them to do that just for us, so that we
That's
could
right.
make that happen. So,
I don't know that we're going to get into much of the remaster today, though. I'm focusing on the original title right now. We can queue it
exactly.
up if we have extra time at the end.
Yeah. So, today we are looking at Ryan's chapter in what we lovingly call the Green Book, for obvious reasons. We both have our copies. Yours is blurred, though, because of your blurring.
Oh,
So,
yes. Sorry.
music in the role playing games, Heroes and Harmonies, edited by William Gibbons and Stephen Raleigh. A lot of good people are in this book. There's a lot of fascinating chapters. We will probably end up covering most of it throughout the life of this stream. I envision us doing of the major edited collections if it goes on long enough. Of course, there will be new things coming out too, so we'll want to keep on top of all the good things. My mic is back to only left channel. That's all right. Let's figure that out.
Oh, yeah. You got to set it to a mono input rather than a stereo input again.
Yeah, hold on. That's easy to do. I switched. I'm using Streamlabs now instead of OBS, so that is easy enough to do. I just gotta switch it over.
Yeah, just fix that default really quick.
Okay.
I'm really excited to talk about some of the process in moving this from a conference paper to the book chapter rather than don't get me wrong, I've got the game loaded behind the scenes. We're going to be playing soon. But uh, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk a little bit about process and materials in addition to just having the game up and live.
Cool. Do I sound better? Hopefully. Hopefully I'm down mixed properly. And we can kind of go with that. All right. Cool. All right. So let's just jump right in. This chapter is called Operatic Conventions and Expectations in Final Fantasy VI. Excellent. So I always like to have that title, that first page there, which
Mm.
this was scanned out of the book, so it's like not quite 90 degrees here, but I do my best. Because I had a physical copy of the book. I didn't have a PDF to excerpt from. So that's my actual book, which was water damaged when it was delivered, it was raining, and I was not at home when it was delivered. So by the time I got it, it's like all warped and stuff.
Mm.
My copy has always been a little wonky, but I love it anyway, and it's still readable. It didn't ruin anything. It's just funny looking. So, operatic conventions and expectations in Final Fantasy VI. There is a Chicago-style formatted citation for you all. Came out in 2020. And just a quick content warning, in case anybody's not familiar with Final Fantasy VI, there is an attempted suicide. And we will be sort of alluding to it. We won't go into any kind of graphic detail. The game, I don't think, goes into what you would think of as graphic detail. But
And we will kind of elide showing the exact moment.
yeah, we
But
won't show it.
the moments immediately before and immediately after are wildly musically interesting. So we are going to come up to that on both ends of it.
Yeah.
We'll just have Dana kind of blacken the stream during the actual moment.
Yeah, we'll let you know when that is. All right. So, what I pulled is your thesis, and you can tell me that's not my thesis, but I said your thesis is in this chapter. I argue that the opera sequence is not merely a novelty, but rather that the entire game is organized around notions of theatrical and especially operatic production.
I mean, yeah, that's it.
You say I argue, so I mean, that's a thesis right there.
I really like making it very clear.
Yeah, I do too.
Right? It's one of my accessible writing goals. Because I often assign this work not to graduate students, but I teach this green book to my undergraduate non-majors. And so writing with kind of a gaming audience that isn't necessarily highly musically educated in mind is something that shows up with some regularity in my work.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think increased, clarity and accessibility of writing in our field is a strength of ours, because it allows us to communicate with folks outside of academia. We are constantly trying to bring in practitioners and all the musicians and composers and sound designers and anybody involved in gaming into what we're doing, and sort of show them how much we respect what they're doing too. Like, it's not this like, oh, I'm in academia.
Exactly.
Like, a lot of us are drawing on fan production and just the immense amount of knowledge that these avid gamers have. It's like we don't have any more claim to that just because our research methods are a little different. So I always appreciate having that accessibility. So to kind of argue that the opera sequence is sort of generating a lot of material in the game here. There's similarities to opera, not just in the fact that there is an in-game opera that is so foregrounded and it's a big sequence, but it's also in the ways that characters are introduced to players, the use of leitmotif, the epilogue, and the structure of the plot.
Yes, and I think, very quickly, one line that I kept from the conference presentation that I admit worked a little better at Music in the Moving Image than it does in print, but I kept it anyways, the very end of the chapter, where I write, I offer this analysis of the game as something of an opera playbill that might accompany a critical playthrough of Final Fantasy VI, kind of foreshadowing the creation of the Thursday night stream, honestly.
Yeah.
It's typical of the program notes that are included in a playbill to offer some reflections on the work as a whole, revealing new insights to even those audience members intimately familiar with the work. And of course, that is the ultimate goal here.
Yeah. So, earlier since you mentioned Music in the Moving Image, I always like asking about sort of the genesis of these particular works. So tell us a little bit. It started as a conference paper. Sort of how did it end up in Will and Steve's book, and what kind of changes did you experience along the way?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So it ended up at Music and the Moving Image because that was just my conference destination very early on in my graduate career. Sumant Gopinath, who is a music theorist at the University of Minnesota and was on my dissertation committee, recommended that conference to me as a potential destination for my work at the time. And my earlier work on horror games was very much in line with what Music in the Moving Image was up to at the time. And so I just kind of kept going to what was and remains an excellent conference. If you've not been to NYU for Music in the Moving Image, it's awesome. I have not been in far too long and need to find a way to make my way back at some point now that the pandemic is kind of in theory, waning, but that's a conversation we're going to table.
Yeah.
But it was the tradition, the expectation back then, to some extent now as well, I suppose, that you have a handout if you're doing a lot of musical analysis in your conference talks. Some way to, not unlike this PowerPoint presentation, guide people along as you speak. And of course, I had some media examples that I showed as well, but the handout was something of an expectation. And I'm actually, Dana, I'm going to switch away from sharing RetroArch, and instead I'm going to share uh, just my monitor with you for now.
Sounds good. Yeah, so we can see a little bit of the original here.
Yes, so this is the handout I included. It's a 2-pager, so let me know, Dana, when we're live on stream, because I can't jump back to stream as I share it this way.
Yeah, it's doing weird thing. Oh my gosh, why is it so tiny?
Do you need me to reshare it as a window instead of a screen?
I don't think it's you.
Okay.
It's just like...
Audience might not be able to read this text. What I can tell you is the text is the descriptions that we will get to. Dana has a very nice slide for Locke, I think, showing you what the short descriptions of each character are.
Add source. Okay, that's better. All right, and then I just gotta crop it a little bit.
Okay. So this was the first page. It is, I'll discuss Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3 in a moment here. But this is the list of characters in Final Fantasy VI and the brief descriptions of those characters that you are provided upon meeting them for the first time. That was page 1. And then page 2 of the handout was kind of my big summary of my talk. If this is an opera, operas have acts and scenes. And I have, in some ways, subjectively here, decided like titles for each scenes, but more importantly, where the scene breaks, if we are to understand the game in this way, occur. Mm-hmm. And one of the things to manage in terms of resources between giving this as a conference talk, having my own internal information on the game, and writing the book chapter is that this table only exists in this format in this conference handout, which these days, of course, I rarely show. It does not appear as a table in the book. I don't think it necessarily needs to. But it is also not particularly as detailed as it could be. Mm-hmm. So we can see, and we'll jump to the beginning of each act here momentarily in the game itself, which I also have open. But let me jump for now to the materials that I keep internally for my own use and notes that only make their way to the public in sort of a curated form, including that handout. So what you're looking at now is to make the research part of doing the research for this, what was then a conference talk and then a book chapter, is I have played Final Fantasy VI and taken extensive notes if you only follow the critical path. What track plays at which time for the entirety of Final Fantasy VI.
Which is
such
a cool resource to have.
I joked on social media that I made 25 save states of FF6 yesterday for Dana for this talk today in about 3 hours. This type of note-taking took me significantly longer than that to pull off. This was weeks of work, but it was well worth it. And given how often that I have returned to Final Fantasy VI, both personally and professionally now, this is a resource I open with some frequency on my computer.
That's so fabulous.
But I really wish there was an easier way to get this type of track listing for more video games, other than like extensive manual effort to get it done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's super useful, and it's been a little bit helpful in our playthrough of the Pixel remaster too, because there are tracks that you sort of associate with one area, and it turns out, oh no, that actually shows up way earlier. That happened a few times where I didn't have a transcription ready because I'm like, I forgot this played here.
And
So,
there are often times where, when we start talking about what counts and what does not count as a leitmotif, we can now know exactly all of the times that, for instance, Forever Rachel
shows up.
plays for you.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's a little pixelaty on screen just because of like trying to crop down from your window,
Yeah.
but
I'm
folks get
gonna.
the idea.
That's right. You can actually mute that source on stream. I'll switch back to RetroArch, Dana, which will open when we need it. You can go back to your PowerPoint while I do that.
Sounds good. Whoop. All right. So yeah, this started as a conference presentation, and then when Will and Steve were doing their Green Book, I'm trying to remember. Did they just ask everybody to be in that, or did they do like a call for papers, or did they do both? I don't
I
remember.
was asked.
I think I was asked too. So maybe they
After my
mostly did
first
that.
year of presenting at Music in the Moving Image, where I spoke on Left 4 Dead, which I'd love to discuss later, incidentally, if this stream continues for as long as I'm hoping it does. Steve Reale actually asked me if I had any interest in thinking about hosting a conference. And of course, I was a first-year graduate student. He did not know that at the time.
He was looking for
And
Nactigum partners, you mean?
yes, and I was just not in a career position to like have any authority or know what that was yet.
That's funny. And of course, that was my first conference that I ever presented at. I had gone to AMS in November earlier that year. And I wouldn't have known it was happening, but I met Neil Lerner at that conference. It was in New Orleans. I was like fangirling over Neil Lerner because I adore his work, obviously. Video games, disability studies, hello. So I went up and I told him my dissertation was going to do both of those things at the same time. And his response was, "Oh my God, there's two of us." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, this person that I, worship is like interested to talk to me." And then he asked, kind of what I was working on, and I think I must have told him about the, let's see, that would have been the Bach paper that I was writing for a seminar, and he was like, "Oh, you must have missed the CFP." So they had me send it in, even though I had like missed the deadline entirely, because I hadn't known, I wasn't on like the right list. I didn't know about it. So that was how I got there. So anyway, so you were asked to be in the book.
That's right. And then you can, of course, see the chapter as it's printed. In this slide, though, as you made your way through the chapter to put this together, there is in the printed book one paragraph about the previous Final Fantasy games, maybe a paragraph and a half, if we include like a sentence about crystals existed in the NES games primarily. The draft version had a lot more, because one of my arguments in understanding Final Fantasy VI as in opera is to understand it as trying to be something more than a video game, which is part of an argument that kind of ended up getting cut for the sake of brevity and clarity in the final book. But Chris Kohler, who wrote the boss fight book on Final Fantasy V, makes an argument that I had never read before until then, and I absolutely adore. And that is that we should not understand Final Fantasy VI as the close of a second trilogy of games. And we usually understand the Final Fantasy games as 1 through 3, the 8-bit games on the 8-bit hardware, 4 through 6, the 16-bit games on the 16-bit hardware, 7 through 9, the PlayStation 1 games, and then 10, 11, 12, insofar as we count 11 at all, the PS2 generation. In many ways, that's very easy to do if what we care about is graphics and hardware. But it obfuscates who is the director of these things and what goals are they setting out to accomplish, both within the franchise and without, as pushing the boundaries of what video games can be in terms of an interactive storytelling medium. And Kohler argues that the first 5 games are the games directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, and the 6th game is his first game where he has stepped away from the director role, and it's also the first game without kind of this Aristotelian understanding of elemental crystals.
Mm-hmm.
right, which is now in the slide here. Similarly, Final Fantasy, you could argue 4 as well, but all of them kind of revolve around this idea of job classes. Uh, there is a character who is the sword wielder, who is the casting character, etc. And Final Fantasy VI absolutely shatters that convention. The crystals themselves having been shattered in Final Fantasy V and are now absent in Final Fantasy VI. That, and I did get this line back into the book, all the characters just become super mages at the end. They have job titles in the game, but none of those really matter. And in fact, they were not present in the English Super Nintendo release, though they are restored for us in the Game Boy Advance and the Pixel Remaster.
Mm-hmm. And where do
So
those show up for the player when they do show up? In the menu, or
they show up in the menu screen.
Mm-hmm.
Originally, and Kohler is invested enough in the Japanese side of the culture to make this particular argument, they show up in this book as well, which I'm holding up to the camera now. The Japanese guidebook for Final Fantasy VI.
It's blurring it as a background.
I'm sorry that it's blurring it as a background. It's very pretty and delightful.
Pretty.
And it explains who all of these characters are and what job class, literally, they have.
So like Strago's a blue mage, right?
For instance, Tina Branford, magic fighter. And then we turn the page here. We'll go to the next character. Locke Cole, treasure hunter. Which is fun that it describes him that way and not thief.
And not thief, yeah. He's very particular about that. He's very, very sensitive.
Edgar is introduced, and then we're not going to read all of these. Edgar is introduced as the first machinist in the Final Fantasy franchise, which is a job class that has gained importance since and remains playable in things like Final Fantasy XIV.
Yeah.
But so that system exists, but is absolutely broken in Final Fantasy VI. I think we can probably go to the next slide here.
Yeah, because and honestly, when you talk about describing everybody as super mages, that's also just how I end up playing. Like in the Dark World, I end up just teaching everybody all the magic. Even the ones that aren't as strong magic users, it's like I'm such a completionist. I teach them all every spell. So I'm very tedious with my Final Fantasy VI playthroughs. So yeah, you mentioned that here. Large ensemble cast, but the individual characters' jobs are set for them. So instead of the player saying, well, I want to have a fighter and a white mage and a black mage, instead they just kind of come with these presets and these individual abilities, and then the player only very much later in the game gets to say, well, I really like using, X ability.
Yeah.
So I want to put that person in my regular rotation. But in, the first half of the game in particular, you kind of have it whoever's with you at the time, and you have to learn how to negotiate those different groupings, which can be a challenge if somebody, has a play style where they, go all fighters or, just something like that. You sort of have to learn. And I never got as into the stats behind the game, but you sort of have to learn how to negotiate where you are with who you have.
Yeah, and quickly, though, and I wish this had found its way into the book, but it's more draft material that got cut. Unlike Final Fantasy IV, the job class does not determine the identity of the character.
Yeah.
For instance, in Final Fantasy IV, this noble character with the heart of gold is the paladin, right? The kind of darker, brotherly character who betrays the party a couple of times ends up being the dragon knight, right? Like, the girl is the white mage, and yes, I realize that is sexist, but it also is demonstrably put into practice throughout the entirety of the 90s here. That the girl character is the white mage, the quirky, rude child is the wizard, right? The old man is the sage, right?
Right.
Final Fantasy IV is trading in the stereotypes created by its predecessors, including Dragon Quest and others. So the job class and the character identity are very closely linked. Final Fantasy V, on the other hand, quickly removes job classes, and in so doing does not really have an answer for how to define character identity. It's pretty widely acknowledged at this point that FF5's weakness, if there is one, is that the characters are kind of amorphous blobs with no real distinct personality per se.
In that way, though, I see more of a similarity in that game to tabletop gaming, where you are sort of
Yes.
molding them and choosing a class, but ultimately it's you doing the role playing.
Yeah. It's Final Fantasy VI that kind of represents, again, a departure from what the job system is used for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it is not here used to define most of the identities of the characters. I think Terra is perhaps the only exception here, maybe arguably Celis as well as the two kind of Magitech Knights or half Espers. I mean, if your job class is tied to your racial identity, uh, then sure. But excuse me, there is no like white mage female
Mm-hmm.
character, for instance, right? And Edgar as the machinist, I mean, his real role is the king politically,
Right.
right? And there's no reason for Sabin as the brother of the king to be the monk class, insofar as this game has one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Character class and what they can do is really kind of separated from their political identity within the game, which I think is really great and a
Mm-hmm.
big step forward
Yeah.
that pushes
So
us towards what eventually comes to even more fruition in Final Fantasy VII and VIII, where character identity and gameplay are almost completely divorced from one another.
mm-hmm. So all of that setup, I'm gonna guess, and you can tell me if I'm right here. Was the idea in cutting it just that wasn't as directly related to the musical argument, that it was more of like gameplay departure?
Yes, a lot of it had to do with gameplay departure, and a lot of it had to do with some assumed knowledge because Final Fantasy VI is one of those big canonical titles that the book chapter did not need quite as much explanation and backstory as I was giving it.
I see. Yeah.
Right? Somebody who is a target audience reader of this book probably knows what this particular video game is, even if they have not heard of it in detail.
And even if they haven't played 5 or some of the earlier
Right.
ones. Yeah. So the opera, of course, is the one of the most striking sequences. You know, people remember it years later. Will Cheng has a book chapter focusing on the use of voice in the game, but the opera is a big piece of that. Kefka's Laugh is kind of another piece of it.
Yeah.
The opera is about a third of the way through the game, and as most of us know, but just a quick recap, the party is trying to meet up with this gambler and airship owner, Setzer Gabbiani, who is in love with the star of the opera, Maria, and wants to kidnap her and make her his wife. And how convenient, Maria looks exactly like Celis, who's in our
I
party.
mean, lots of things in films and video games are just way too convenient, and this is certainly one of them,
This is
right?
one of them. So we're gonna give him
Yes.
the old bait and switch, right? We're gonna have him kidnap Celis, and then have the rest of the party like just be hanging out in the airship, like, "Hey, buddy, you want to like help
That's
us
right.
get around the world and join our
And
cause?"
a quick aside that I wish I had caught, but thankfully Sebastian Deacon, who authored the boss fight books, Final Fantasy VI book, caught for me. Maria is almost certainly named for Maria Callas.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Totally
Yeah.
makes sense. So yeah, the old bait and switch, like that's all well and good that they look the same, but of course you have to suspend your your disbelief here.
There almost has to be an opera, incidentally, about a twin substituting or something like that.
Oh,
like
I'm
somebody
sure.
who looks like that. That feels pretty common as a contrivance.
Yeah, yeah, or there's like mistaken identity stuff, dressing up as someone else, like that's all
Yeah.
over opera, right?
Right.
So here, though, the interesting and little difficulty is, okay, she's a former imperial general. Does she have any opera training? Like, you're like, okay, it's one thing to just like replace her in a play and learn the lines and be a bad actress or something, but the idea that she's going to step into an operatic role, like you. Okay, that's interesting, right?
Right.
But so we get to the opera itself. It's part cutscene, part playable opera sequence. You actually have to remember the lines and plug them in the right order, and you know, not take
Yes.
too long, or you fail and you have to do the opera again. So yeah, there are 3 major scenes. We have Draco, the champion of the West, who sings of his love for Maria on the battlefield. And then, kind of our Act 2, Maria's homeland has been taken by Prince Rolls of the East. So the East and the West are at war. And is singing of her undying love for Draco, even though she is set to marry Rolls, who is, saying, hey, I took over your castle, so you get to marry me now. This is the big aria that Celis has to sing. And then our final scene is meant to be a duel between Draco and Rolls for Maria's hand. It ends up getting interrupted in the game because on the
because
side of
octopus shows up.
Because an octopus shows up.
Like you do.
On the side of this whole plot to bait and switch Setzer and get access to the airship, you find out that our comedic villain Ultros wants to ruin the opera. Like, for reasons.
Right. I mean, this is one of those wild video game things. Like, there's absolutely no reason to have, like, a random octopus show up. You can't justify this. It's just weird.
And like, why does he want to wreck the opera? Because reasons. And so he's up on the in the rafters, and he's got like a 4-ton weight or whatever, and he's going to try to drop it onto the stage.
So
and you have to go stop him.
This Back to the Future 2 style sequence of racing across the rafters to save the day.
Exactly. And then you fall down to the stage, and then the impresario has to be like, "This is all part of the opera," and he kind of improvises there.
Yeah.
Good times. I love this quote here. You say, "This sequence of events, the opera, the introduction of main characters, showdown between main characters, and wildly unexpected departure from reasonable predictions of the outcome of the showdown nearly mirrors the narrative arc of the whole of Final Fantasy VI. The game's story is divided into 3 major arcs, which this chapter refers to as acts, fittingly, each beginning with the same event, a character waking up in a bed, confused about how they arrived there."
Yes. So do you want to jump very quickly to those points in the game here?
You mentioned the image again later.
Okay, we'll do it later because you've got a slide for it.
We'll show those 3.
Okay.
So I think that's the one after this one.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the character introduction screens always fade to black, and then there's a short character introduction, a little text, which is akin to the title page of an opera or program notes. And in your chapter, you have the title page of Ronaldo. And as you can see here...
Right, and I could have picked the title page or like program cover, if you will, from just about any opera from
here we've got
from 1700 through 1900.
Right, so we have Eustasio, the brother of Geoffrey,
right.
Gefredo.
I had no specific scholarly motivation for choosing Ronaldo, incidentally, but I was writing about Ronaldo for an assignment for Kelly Harness, whose specialty is the 17th century. Mm-hmm. So that's why Ronaldo is chosen in the book. Has no real basis in my personal preference for opera, or because this is a particularly standout example. Again, like most operas have this page, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it just gives you a sense. Oh, okay, El Moreno is Gefredo's daughter, destined to marry Ronaldo, etc.
Right.
So here, juxtaposed with that, we have Locke's introduction, treasure hunter and well-worn traveler searching the world over for relics of the past. So all of the characters get a moment like this.
Right. It doesn't exactly tell you what voice party sings, though Locke is clearly a tenor.
Players can rename the characters. This is such an interesting point, and I like that you sort of speak to what could be a complication in this. Players can, of course, rename the characters. A lot of us don't. I know I was always kind of like, I'm going to go with whatever the character's named. Instead of replacing them. The only time that I would change things is if it was all caps and I had the ability to do lowercase. I would make the name like regular casing, because I don't like that it would be like, Locke, and then the rest of the text is normal.
So like there is an argument to be made that the character names appear in all caps because that's the way that screenplays
like a script
are written.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. But that's the only change I would make. But let's say that Locke shows up and you rename him to Ryan. So he goes throughout the game being referred to as Ryan. In the epilogue, they appear like casting in an opera. So it'll say Ryan as Locke Cole, and it'll present their canonic name. So you say, put another way, the game foregrounds the idea that a player names the character for their own unique staging, that is, playthrough, of the production, not for all players. After each name is shown, a brief vignette starring the character in question plays in the spirit of the curtain call following a theatrical performance, which is neat. Then we get to the leitmotivic scoring, which is, of course, common technique in Wagnerian opera, of course, but also in film scoring, which is where most folks encounter it now. So you say Uematsu definitely would have encountered it in things like John Williams scores.
Right, and of course, I don't have personal access to Nobuo Uematsu to ask him where, in fact, he learned this technique from,
But
but we
it's
do know that
so
he is
common.
not formally trained in the academic sense. So it's almost certain, at least in my mind, that like he saw Star Wars before seeing Wagner.
Right. I think that's true for a lot of us. I
Right.
didn't really, I didn't, I mean, I even what little I learned of Wagner in like undergrad, because he was just so long. Like, we didn't spend a lot of time on the operas. It was just kind of like a very
Right.
generic, here's the ring cycle. I didn't see the ring cycle until beginning of my doctoral degree. The Met did one of those, like, go to the movie theater and watch the live production things.
Yeah. Also, I did take a beat to hate on Adorno.
Yeah, I
Sorry,
thought
I'm
this was a
not
good one.
sorry about
Yeah,
it.
so you mentioned both Adorno and Hans Eisler. As many folks cite in film literature, they're against filmic leitmotif. They say that it's superficial signposting. You know, it just shows up without a lot of transformation. Just that it's not as good as what Wagner's doing, where he's really transforming things and using them in these really powerful ways of
Yeah.
signifying, you know. And I love your point here. You're like, okay, that's fine, but like, really the golden age of like film leitmotivic scoring hasn't happened when they're writing. So
That's right. I
we
mean,
think of Star Wars, but like, Star Wars didn't exist when Adorno and Eisler wrote those things.
the big films that Adorno would have been speaking against, if you will, though I'm not sure he would use that word to describe his work, is Gone with the Wind and Casablanca as like the
Mm-hmm.
latest film,
Mm-hmm.
chronologically speaking, that he would have engaged with.
Makes
And
sense.
if your point of reference is essentially not those two exceptions, but Errol Flynn swashbuckling films,
Right.
uh, I do actually buy an argument that those films don't do music the same way that Wagner does. I don't think they want to,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah, totally. Um,
Yeah,
and
and Andrew is right
and
that Steiner over tries to overemphasize the technical complexity of his work in various avenues, not just with that one word choice,
right.
but in a variety of ways that Adorno is almost certainly pushing back against, though he does not cite Steiner specifically.
I also don't think that having a more simplistic form of leitmotif, the signposting leitmotif, necessarily means something is bad, because it's an extremely effective technique. So,
Oh yeah,
like, yeah, okay, it's not doing the same amount of things as Wagner, but a lot of films' runtime aren't even as long as the operas too. So, um,
yeah.
yeah, I don't think there's anything
Well,
wrong with
that's the other thing
signposting in
is
general.
the two Godfather movies. We can ignore the third one if we really want to, and the three Star Wars films.
Mm-hmm.
They are the length of Wagner
Mm-hmm.
operas, plural,
So they have the space to
right?
develop these things. In a single
Yes, and
movie, you can do a little bit, but you're not going to have that type of like long form development.
right. But again, Final Fantasy VI for the average player is a 40-hour experience.
Mm-hmm.
Like it might as well have been that aliens had landed, honestly, compared to what
Exactly.
Adorno had to analyze.
And you
I
say
think
that here,
we
you talk about the scope. So in write, and you cite
yeah.
Marcia Citron here in writing on how the Godfather's trilogy of films is operatic in scope. Marcia Citron describes the epic structure of the films, including their long run times, extended narrative spans, and the use of themes commonly found in 19th century Italian opera: honor, loyalty, betrayal, and revenge. The Japanese role playing game might serve as a means by which to reconcile the conflict between opera and cinema described above. By the above definition and Citron's logic, Final Fantasy VI is certainly a game of operatic proportions. So now we get to the act structure. I pulled just the screenshots here because neatly the game sort of shows you where each act starts because a character wakes up in a bed. So now we can switch over here and show.
Yeah, let's do
Ooh,
that. Let me know when to.
I have to resize the window because I
Oh, sure.
had to do some weird moments there with.
With Word. Yeah, sorry about
Yeah,
that.
no worries. Okay, get the PowerPoint down. Oh, and actually, I think I'm going to switch to. Why isn't that? Because I'd have to redo the window. Never mind. Okay.
All right. While Dana finishes resizing that, we are going to watch the very end of the prologue here.
All right. I'm going to cut off the chat a little bit. I still have to do some... I'm using a new... I'm using Streamlabs now instead of OBS, so still some things here. With, trying to
Yeah,
figure out.
I'm going to unmute now here too.
Yeah. Let's see.
So there's this giant explosion. She blacks out.
I'm not hearing it.
There it is. And Tara wakes up in this bed. It's a very clever design of the sprite. See, she's just standing, right?
Okay, we had this working earlier. I'm not hearing it. But, I mean, we're mostly want to get the visual here that she wakes up in the bed.
Hold on a second. I got you covered.
There we go.
There.
That'll track now for a minute.
Yep.
Okay,
I had to reshare again. Yeah, the window redid its thing. I was sharing a screen, right?
Oh, I see. Okay, let me...
Yep. But Tara wakes up in this bed, and she is just, again, the standing sprite looks asleep in the bed. Really nice design here. Quickly, we're going to load some states.
There we go.
In a weird but very cool gameplay moment, you actually get the narrative choice at one point. There's a branching path situation. And where an opera or a film would have to just provide this as a linear experience, Final Fantasy VI gives you the choice. Each of these three scenarios is scene 7, if you will, in my notes. You finish all those scenarios. Sorry, we don't have time to do any of them. We don't need to do that one. Look, all three scenarios are now done. Decisive battle is about to take place at the top of the mountain. We also don't have time to do the decisive battle. Here it is. Yay, we've done it now. And now we're on top of the mountain after the battle. And here's what happens. I'm going to mute so that I can fast forward. The whole goal of the game thus far has been to reunite Tara with this Esper. We saw the explosion that was the end of the prologue. And now we're going to have that conversation between the two of them a second time.
And the fast forwarding in the emulator is doing us a solid here.
Yes.
You can just kind of see it.
But if I turn the sound on during fast forward, it sounds like garbage. So we're going to leave the sound off for just a moment here. Tara transforms and flies away. We have no idea at this point what has happened to her.
We just see her.
See her kind of freaking out.
Sequence sped up. All right, and then...
And then... Look what piece of music is playing. This is our start of Act 2. The same bed and the same piece of music, which will quickly turn into an arrangement of Tara's theme, though she is not present on camera right now. There it is. So again, kind of this leitmotivic use here. And the second act of the game revolves around finding out what has happened to Tara and making sure that she's okay. We've got Cole and Jen for the Rachel stuff. Jidor for the opera sequence, which I don't think we need to actually view right now.
It's long.
Yeah. They reconcile you eventually. Here. Okay. I'm going to turn this down. The Emperor, spoilers, betrays you. And now you have to climb the top of this floating continent that you can hear from this music is positioned as a last boss dungeon. It has the type of instrumentation with lots of electric instruments that feels like a final boss zone, and this fight has a unique piece of music, which I'll jump into, that sounds like the final boss music. Look at how scary this thing is. It gets a text introduction, which hasn't happened before.
overlay.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Trying to get it to not look like garbage. So apologies to everyone as I'm messing with that.
All right, I'm
Hopefully
going
you're
to
watching
mute
the
my
pretty
sound and
gameplay.
mute my sound and fast forward again. This boss is going to die, though. Yeah, there we go. I am cheating right now. All the characters are level 99 to trivialize the actual gameplay, so we can talk about music instead. I don't do this on Thursday nights. The plot progresses. It looks like we are going to go fight the Emperor and his assistant here, Kefka. And look, we're at the top of the world looking down. This should be, by any reasonable measure, the end of the game. But just like we have dropped an octopus into the middle of our opera, we have a surprise coming up in that we never actually get to fight the Emperor, who is like tingling with energy right now, ready to burn us to smithereens. We're going to elide over this part. Kefka is about to murder him and seize power for himself.
Hooray.
Hooray. Here, I'll unmute here. The world is ending now. Like, this action has real consequences that we have to wrestle with and navigate. Lots of people die. All the characters having retreated to the airship. You'll note I saved Shadow. Get blown away.
And that looks like Chrono Trigger right there.
It does. And Chrono Trigger releases just a year afterwards. I think there's a lot of parallels between like the rise of Lavos and the end of the world here.
Andrew, trivializing gameplay in a game, does that mean I just won the argument against Julianne? That's fun.
No nonsense. That's why I don't cheat on Thursdays.
No fair if she's not here to fight back.
That's right. And then there's silence as we enter Act 3.
Yeah, we get the wind
where
sound.
Celis will eventually wake up in a bed.
The iconic wind sound.
Yeah, Jordan, the argument here has shifted slightly, with apologies, because we're trying to play for time here. That fake-out mirrors the structure of the in-game opera as it unfolds for you, rather than opera principles generally.
Right.
So the in-game opera sequence is just wildly interrupted by nonsense, as is the whole narrative arc of the game at that particular point. And then we have to wrestle with what that means. All right, Celis is going to be in our bed here alone. Again, Act 3 begins. And minor character Sid is going to walk in here if I wait long enough. There we go.
You know what I always wondered? Where has he been sleeping? Well, she's been, like, asleep in the bed for a year. Or whatever. Comatose or whatever it is.
We're going to just elect to not think about that. All right.
Has he just been sleeping downstairs with, like, on the raft? And that's why he's sick?
Sid, spoilers here, almost certainly will die. There is a possible way to save him and kind of overwrite the plot. But Sid is meant to die here.
And
we can show that.
Let's jump back briefly before we do this sequence. If you don't mind.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we've got a moment. Okay. Do you want to mute that really quick? I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
I don't know if it's still going to go through. Because I'm not positive. All right. Just because following the order of your chapter, the next thing after discussing the acts, you talk about camera angles in memory briefly. So I just wanted to point that out, especially because we just hit this moment last night on our playthrough of the Pixel Remaster, where Setzer is going down the stairs in Daryl's tomb to retrieve her airship. And he says, this brings back a lot of memories. And then the rest of the sequence, all the characters are going down the stairs following him, and you're getting his backstory finally. And the way that they do it, as we can see in the slide here, is that the the foreground remains unchanged, and you're actually interacting through that. You're following him down the stairs, and you're
Yes,
getting
you're
little
controlling
snippets.
Celis, the blonde woman on the staircase at this
Yeah.
point. But you're shown in some technical wizardry, I will note,
Mm-hmm.
uh, a different camera perspective, almost as if we're on the ceiling looking down in through uh, kind of a little box, seeing the past.
Yeah.
The camera pans up ever so slightly, and it's one of those really elegant. We don't really have a word for this in gaming, but I'm going to appropriate cinematography for this conversation about what is possible with the way we display things to you
Mm-hmm.
in video games. There are a lot of spaces in which Final Fantasy VI innovates on this front, but this one might be the best.
Yeah, and it's so clear to anybody playing and watching that like Setzer's on the stairs, and this is the present moment, and the way that that's just against that black backdrop, you're getting this backstory, and like, oh wow, that's a flashback without having to cut out of the main frame. It's sort of being like
Right?
overlaid, but not in a way where it's like interrupting the main image. It's just kind of sitting there above, like it's in his head almost like a thought bubble. Um,
Yeah.
the remaster last night when we hit this sequence, it put like a white ghostly kind of outline around it, and I thought that was totally unnecessary. To me, this is very clear when you play it. I don't think
Yeah,
it
and we can
needed any
actually jump to
more.
this point in just a second if we wanted to as well.
I don't think we
But
needed
yeah,
any
it's
more.
very clear.
So yeah, the musical, or sorry, the camera angle work was sort of discussing, kind of going along with this like operatic scope, epic scope. And then you get to kind of the main musical section here, where we're going to see some really interesting moments here. The idea of paired musical themes, and this kind of goes back to Wagnerian leitmotif, where themes are often in kind of thematic families, where they're derived from each other based on usually a lot of interval relationships.
Yeah.
So like, oh, okay, there's a fourth, so we hear that in like Siegfried's theme, right? And sort of themes that are related to Siegfried in some significant way have that rising fourth gesture and things like that. We have a very similar thing happen in this game where we have character themes, their main leitmotifs, and then they several of them get like a second form that is usually a lot more like pathos background. It gives you some sort of like hint into their memories, what drives them. I think you describe it as like the secret part of themselves that they don't want to let everyone see.
Yeah.
And luckily, Ryan gets extra beautiful things today because I did all these transcriptions for our stream. So I just had these. So instead of showing the musical transcriptions in the book, which are lovely, and Jarrell helped with those, right? I think you credited.
That's right. Yeah, Jarrell Jones
Shout
helped
out
with
to
those.
Jarrell
Arrow
Jones for
on
helping
mine.
with those lovely melodic transcriptions. I have the full chip transcription. So, like, for example, one of the paired themes here is Lock and Forever Rachel. And we'll just watch the first loop of this, if I can get it to play. Ah, no. Come on. There we go. So this is our A section. Very heroic, because Locke sees himself as the hero. Now we get our B section. All right.
And then it loops at this point right
Yeah.
there.
And significantly, Forever Rachel flips that. We actually get the B theme first, and then the A theme. But
That's
now
right.
it's sadder. It's in a minor key, and of course, this is reflecting that his love, Rachel, was going adventuring with him, and he was unable to save her from an injury that had her in a permanent coma. Or did she die? Oh, she dies, and then the guy preserves her
She's in
body.
a coma for a while. She then wakes up with amnesia
Right.
and only remembers Locke like in the moments before she passes away. It's a very like melodrama, telenovela, soap opera situation.
Yeah. And so this is that theme, which inverts his. So good. It's such a sparse texture, but it really, really conveys so much.
That bass slide up in Forever Rachel is later paired against, in a different way, the bass slides down in the Falcon's airship theme, creating this subtle connection between the related backstories of Locke Rachel and Setzer Daryl.
And then we got our loop point. So we get that kind of similar A and B theme, but they're flipped there, which is really interesting. And of course, the timbral changes, the instrument changes. So what's interesting about Locke or Figaro, the Figaro brothers castle theme becomes Coin Song, and you get the backstory of the brothers. Setzer's theme is paired with Epitaph, where we get the backstory on Daryl. We usually get the sort of heroic original version of the character's theme first. Celis, as you argue, is unique in that it's actually inverted, where we hear what we would call the alternate version of the theme first, and then Celis sort of identifies with that moment in the opera and adopts Maria's aria as her own leitmotif. So compared to the aria, it's interesting there. We probably won't have time to listen through all these, but her theme ends up being a lot more wistful, slower. You know, the melody is on sort of a music box, which gives it sort of like an innocent quality, and it's very vulnerable.
Yeah, as we talk, I can start that theme playing for us here on the Super Nintendo game here, because it's worth hearing quite quickly. She discovers that Sid has fallen asleep and dies, and she refuses to believe it. Here it's starting as the realization is hitting her.
Yeah, so here's her theme. We might go a little over today if that's okay with you.
Yes, that's fine with me.
Okay.
And crucially, control of the character is removed from you here, not unlike the opera. And just like the original opera sequence on Super Nintendo, the control has been restored to me now.
Yeah, you have to
just like I am dancing, instead of dancing with Draco, I have to climb the cliff side as Celis. And I'm going to invite you to leave the sound playing, but obscure the video, Dana.
Switch back over.
You'll notice this cliff, as Dana is cutting, is exactly the same shape as the castle from the opera sequence. Yeah, you can have that slide displayed instead here. We won't actually show the jump here.
I'm going to actually jump back and read your prose here. You say, for each of the other characters with an altered theme, second theme reveals events of the past that drive the character in question, a secret otherwise closely guarded and rarely shared with the other cast members. Celis' secret in her desire is to have hope that her situation will improve even in the face of past hardship, in the same ways that the opera character Maria maintains her hope of a reunion with Draco in the face of adversity. The difference here is that Celis, unlike Maria, in the wake of the world ending and sort of this apocalyptic version of the world we knew before, even the continents are rearranged, she ends up giving up hope at the beginning of Act 3. And Ryan points out here, the cliff mirrors the look of the castle set. So that identification with that theme is even clearer, beyond the musical identification.
And Will Chang actually has the most elegant sentence for this particular moment, where he writes in Sound Play, and I quote it in the book here, "Having lost all hope and voice, this heroine, with nothing left to live for, nothing left to sing or say, surrenders to Kafka-esque despair."
I know it's like close to Kafka-esque too. Like
Hmm.
the play there always seemed really nice. So she has leapt, but she has survived.
That's right. You can show us the.
Yeah.
Are we watching the game feed again now?
Yep.
So she does survive, and you see a bird kind of nursing her back to health.
And you're like, oh, what's on that bird? Like that doesn't look like the other birds that we've seen.
Right.
And
And
then
the bird.
she's initially
It's
kind of
wearing,
upset at the bird, and then she
the
looks
bird
down.
is wearing Locke's bandana,
A bandana? No, it can't be.
right? And instead of hearing either Locke's theme or Celis's theme,
Notice what we
in
have here.
the most Wagnerian leitmotivic moment of the game, we hear Rachel's music instead.
Right. So to quote what you say here, while you're showing this moment, both of the two occasions that Celis's theme plays have her longing for Locke, wanting him to serve as a symbol of forgiveness for her past misdeeds. I love this line. Though it goes unspoken between the pair, Locke needs her for the same reasons. Using a leitmotivic technique, the score acknowledges the intertwined relationship between these two characters twice. The first time is at the opening of Act 3, when Celis sails her raft away from the island with Locke's bandana in her hand. Forever Rachel underscores her departure. This theme, used previously to develop Locke's character, now ties Celis to Locke directly. The epilogue further connects the two characters by pairing the two themes musically, and that's kind of the last big thing I want to listen to. During one of the only serious vignettes in the 8-minute curtain call sequence. It's really elegant how these get layered over each other in the finale.
Yeah, shall we jump to the very end of the game here?
Let us.
All right, I think that's save 26.
Look how prepared
Maybe
Ryan
25.
is. He had all of the gameplay called up so that I didn't have to do it.
What I don't have, though, it is an 8-minute sequence for the epilogue, so we have some fast forwarding to do.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. It's kind of fun to watch Kefka dissolving.
Yes, and if
such
Kefka
a
looks
slow
like
dissolve.
Lucifer in that sequence,
That's intentional.
the whole final boss is a series of, like, Christian mythological references that you must fight, like the Pietà, Michelangelo's sculpture. Like, everything shows up.
I know
in
of
that
at least
fight.
one person who argued that in the dissertation. I talk about that in my FF6 chapter in my dissertation.
That's right.
Those
Yeah,
unaware.
Kefka clearly wants to be a god.
Like
It is
a-
interesting
yeah,
to
like
me that the only
God.
reference they have for that is, like, Christianity, and even though that presumably does not exist within the worldscape of Final Fantasy VI.
Yeah, the fallen angel imagery but it's very nihilistic. He wants to remake the world in nothingness, and that's of course
Yeah.
what, all the characters are like, no, there's a lot to fight for here.
Here's the ending sequence. We'll let it start so you can see that name card reference I talked about earlier. You notice the first thing we see is a book, which I argue represents the libretto of the game's plot itself, now that we have completely shifted artistic perspectives and styles here.
Flipping back.
I love the way kind of the arpeggios on this harp and the turning of the pages line up together.
Oh my gosh, you cite my dissertation? Thank you.
So Cyan, or whatever you put, as Cyan Garamond, etc.
And we see a sword for him, and here we get a
That's right, he's the
reinterpretation of
samurai, and he gets a comic one, I think, right? Involving machinery, maybe?
So, yeah. Yeah, he's like, switch?
He's like, what do I do with it? Oh my god, it's a machine, I can't do anything. He just jumps. Of course, that's what he needed to do, right?
Yeah.
Most of these little vignettes are comical.
Yeah.
We're gonna fast forward, I'm gonna mute the sound again now. Though this whole epilogue is lovely if you've never heard it, but alas, for the sake of time here.
We'll get there when we do our playthrough. We'll see how they render this in the Pixel
That's right.
Master. So yeah, we get Setzer. We'll be able to very quickly see what everybody's little things
That's
are.
right. So Setzer quits being a gambler in that moment, right? He adopts kind of Daryl's confidence instead. Edgar and Sabin have the twin two-headed coin, which I love that the coin is depicted there.
Now I have these stupid muscles. Mog! Yay!
Mog is Mog.
I love Mog.
This is another extra comical one. You grab him by the palm with the crane, like a little kid's game.
Yeah. Watch the hair. Yeah, so they're escaping Kefka's tower here.
Right, right. As the tower crumbles,
Mm-hmm.
we have to like make our way out.
Instead of having that be some playable, here, get out of here quick. Like, I mean, that works in other places in the game to have the get out of the tower moment, but here it's
Yep.
like, okay, that would be kind of anticlimactic, so we're showing these scenes instead.
Yeah. Go-Go the Mimic, of course, has to mimic somebody. There you go.
Mm-hmm. Gao has the scuba helmet.
Yeah. The relevant one is next, so we're gonna watch Gao's here in real time.
If Mog got a heartbreaking melodramatic backstory. Kupo. It would all be told in Kupo, though, so you wouldn't know. Unless you speak Moogle.
This musical moment here is tremendous in every way. The opera comes first as the reference with the flowers, but it's Locke's name first. So again, now we tied Celis to Locke at the beginning of Act 3, and we tie Locke to Celis at the end. And both of them simply get the flowers from the opera sequence. Bum-ba-da. That's Locke's theme in the bass, with the aria up top.
Gosh, it's so good. It works so perfectly.
Forever Rachel, as the floor begins to happen and the repeat of the tragic event that caused Rachel's death is about to repeat itself. This time he's just fast enough. And Locke's theme enters as the resolution to his past and his present.
Unlike Rose in Titanic, he doesn't let go. She says she won't let go.
This is also the only point in the whole 8-minute work that we arrive at a strong cadence with silence after.
Which I think is really significant for the two of them.
Yeah. Then we move on and see the rest of the cast here. And there's some interesting stuff in this medley otherwise that excuse me, that I cut to kind of keep the focus on opera throughout. Mm-hmm. Shadow's theme in particular here is remarkable.
Yeah.
But I think we can probably cut here at this point, I think, Dana.
All right, that is our tour of operatic conventions and expectations in Final Fantasy VI. I'm curious. Obviously, there was chat throughout. I'm curious if anybody has any questions for Ryan here. I'm always interested in sort of the things that got cut, so I'm glad we were able to get into all the Final Fantasy V stuff. You just have so much more exposure to that than the average player who maybe, like me, played this one, played 4. And then played 7 and 8 and, didn't really do the early ones until much later. And I didn't play 5 until we streamed it. So,
yeah,
it's a lot of background, but obviously when you come to a book like this, you do have a set limit for how long it can be. Sometimes they can give you a little room if like another chapter comes in under.
Right.
Your terms of your contract are usually pretty specific that you have, X number of words and you have to divide that up based on however many chapters you have.
Exactly.
So, they're gonna, and the role of the editor too, they're gonna want to sit there and sort of say, this part I think is really interesting. Could you foreground this more? My own chapter for this, they actually had me restructure significantly because of a similar thing where it was like the interesting thing isn't the thing that you thought was the interesting thing, it's this. And I've actually done that in peer review too, where I'm just like, I love this thing, like bring this out, So it is a collaborative process ultimately, but a short book chapter, is certainly never going to cover this, and you end really beautifully by sort of suggesting how much more could be done on this game in particular.
Yeah, I still think that there is room for a little bit more on Final Fantasy VI. At the same time as I kind of agree that we have to slowly move beyond our most canonical works.
Yeah, yeah. But we do have Sebastian's book, which is pretty phenomenal. You know, Will Cheng speaks beautifully to it. His chapter's really good with yours. That actually
Yeah, I think me and Will complement each other very well, actually.
just occurred to me that'd be really nice to like assign those two together in my game class. Like make that a that would be a fun one. Anyway, um, yeah. So what's really neat about this, and the reason, of course, it was easy early on in my streams here to ask the stream team, since I see you all a lot and we're close, to be my first guest. But the other reason that I wanted to have you on to do this one at this moment is that we are in the middle of the Pixel remaster playthrough right now. And
That's right. We have 2 more weeks to go on Final Fantasy VI on Thursday nights.
so we're going
And
to get to see all of those moments. Let's see what they do with that epilogue, you know?
that's right. Yeah. Not this coming Thursday, but 1 week from it. We will have Andrew and Jillian Aversa joining us on stream. Uh, Andy is the arranger and kind of lead organizer of Overclocked Remix's Final Fantasy VI album. And Jillian has performed that opera sequence in a very cool music video format with Tina Guo, who did the cello solo for both Journey and Wonder Woman, the Hans Zimmer scored film.
Yeah, we'll probably watch. Do we have a good video of Jillian's performance?
Oh yeah. There's a professionally produced video for that one.
We can watch that at the relevant moment, and there will be a lot of good transcriptions that week because obviously when we hit Kefka, I'm like, hello, I like to talk about that, so we'll have a lot of comparison to do. We'll probably take a bit of time before we hit that fight to pop over and do some of that and sort of talk through the very basics of how I outline my chapter. The leitmotif. We'll probably play Kafka again and then show some snippets of Dancing Mad. It's going to be a lot of fun, but we've been playing through the game, and so the opera has already happened. And so if you go to twitch.tv/Bardic Knowledge, most of you follow us there too, but the VODs for the recent streams that we've done, you can go back and find the opera sequence where we had Annie Rosen on, an opera singer who was able to just really brilliantly unpack that whole sequence and sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly of how it was done. And we compared the different localizations. So in the original game, of course, it's just sort of a Vox like "oh" sound, but in the modern version, they can have somebody sing the lyrics, and so they had translations. You could watch it in Korean and French and German and English. So we watched most of all of them, I think, and we sort of
we checked out every language that day. Yeah,
at least a little
and
bit.
Annie's ability to speak to what that is like as a performer was tremendous.
Yeah, it was just really good because there one moment here that kind of plays against your argument in the chapter, the way that they decided to render the castle to make it more 3D Octopath Traveler-y, actually wrecks that geometry moment.
Yes.
Where we have the similarity between the cliff and the castle, because the castle was rendered out, and then when we got to this moment, they didn't do the same thing with the cliff. Why would they? And so it actually sort of wrecked the elegance of that moment. So yeah, there are some very interesting throughout. We've had really good guests that have shed just incredible light on this. Matthew Valente, I really enjoyed that week. Certainly we had Sebastian on because of the boss fight book. We had Scott Penick on last night, who has done an absolutely incredible acoustic guitar arrangement album of a bunch of Final Fantasy VI tracks, so we watched some of those last night. So it's just been a really special sequence and a kind of a nice gala celebration of 5 years of streaming.
Yeah.
So, join us for the rest of that. We're not always quite so over the top with all the transcriptions and everything, but we were kind of doing it up right for our 5-year anniversary. But
that's right. And next Friday here at 2:00, is it Pete who's up next?
No, it's Jen who's up next.
Aha, okay.
I don't know if you're still in the chat.
That's awesome.
Jen, but we're going to be doing, I think, one of a favorite of quite a few people. There was in the initial yay, hello. In the initial JSMIG, it was the first issue, right?
It
We
is,
did we
yes,
did
yes.
a colloquy on canons, and it was Will Gibbons, Julian Grasso, Karen Cook, and Hyunjin Park, and everybody's writing about sort of the idea of canons in ludomusicology from different perspectives. And all four of them are great. I think we will probably cover all four in turn at different points. But this is the next collaboration with the American Musicological Society Ludomusicology Study Group. So, they had the same idea to do like a book club, and then they heard about my stream and they're like, will you host us? Because we were just going to do Zoom. And I said, yeah, great. So next week is going to be at 3:30, though. So we will not be doing the regular 2 o'clock time.
Ah, okay.
We're doing it a little later just to accommodate schedules. So we will be a little
Perfect.
later next week. We'll tweet about that, of course. But we're going to look at the wonderful, wonderful issue of canons, and sort of asking questions about the field as a whole and what we can all be doing to make the space, continue to be diverse and
Yeah, no,
inclusive.
I assign Jin's writing for that issue of JSMG with some regularity. It's very, very, very
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, and I think the various pieces all pair together and really like there's nice interplay between all four. Um,
Hmm.
and I think they're all four of them are important in different ways, but I think this is a favorite of a lot of people. So I'm really excited to read that one next week. Um, Other than that, thank you all so much for joining. I know we went a little over, although I've technically left like an hour and a half, 2 hours on Fridays just in case it goes long. I only stick to the strict hour if somebody has to be somewhere else. But yeah, it's my hope that we'll continue doing this, and you all are probably going to be getting messages from me at some point to like, please be on my stream, because it's more fun when I'm not talking to myself and I can have the authors on to unpack everything and tell
Yeah.
me if
Well, this
I
was a blast, Dana. Thanks
nailed
for
it.
having me on here.
It was so good to have you. I'm so glad we got to do this. The timing was fortuitous. So thank you all for joining us for the Kudomusicology Ludomusicology Literature Review stream. We'll see you next week at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, friends.